My name's Roman Krznaric. I'm a writer and a teacher, and I run workshops specifically on how to generate empathy in society to bring about social change. So I work with local communities, I work with development organizations such as Oxfam, I work with governments and individuals to try to work out how we can create social bonds and overcome social barriers using empathy. People are facing risks with respect to climate change in two different ways. Firstly, there are risks through time. That is, there are risks faced for the livelihoods of future generations. And there are also risks across space. That is, there are risks faced by people in developing countries today who are facing challenges to their livelihoods due to extreme weather events, as we're seeing in places in India and Bihar, for example. The problem is that we know all about these risks that people are facing, yet there is not sufficient action by governments, by individuals, by communities to try to ameliorate those risks. There's a gap between knowledge and action. So the question to me is, how do you close that gap? And I think that the big factor that's being ignored in closing that gap is empathy. I think we need to find ways of generating empathy through time and across space to try to challenge climate change and reduce the risks that people are facing. And I think that has been ignored by policymakers. People don't even really think about how do you actually generate a kind of caring and understanding the perspectives of people who are distant strangers, who we don't really even think about very much as human beings, who are not close enough to our lives for us to really care about and feel that we want to do something about as we would for someone close to us, like a family member. I think there is great historical evidence that there have been amazing moments in human history, like in the late 18th century when there was a rise of a social movement to challenge slavery, the buying and selling of human beings. There was a mass empathetic outpouring which brought about a huge social transformation. So can we actually bring that kind of social transformation about today? I think we can, and I think there are a couple of ways that we can try to do this. One thing is to create new kinds of conversation. New kind of conversations across the generations between adults and between young people to get them to get adults, especially those in power, politicians, local community leaders, those who run large multinational companies, to actually think about what life would be like for future generations, to talk to young people, get their views on what their futures are going to be like, how they're feeling about their futures, and thereby generate a way of sort of leaping into the future. So one idea one might have is, I dream of there being conversation camps across this country where people from different generations are talking about climate change and trying to change their thinking and learning to empathize with future generations. The other way of bringing about change around empathy is to create new experiences for people, because I think that's how we change our thinking, we change our lives. That's how we can close the gap between knowledge and action. And now I have another dream here, which is the idea of a climate corps. So in the early 1960s, in the United States, they invented the Peace Corps, where young people would go and work and live with communities in developing countries, and it had a massive change on their thinking. It led to a new generation of political activists being born. And I'd like to see something similar happening in Britain, in the European Union, a climate corps, where when you finish school, for example, when you're 18, you might spend a year living in a developing country, helping them on adaptation projects, adapting to the problems of climate change, for example, building flood defenses or helping them in other ways, and actually getting the raw experience that you need to actually care about these distant strangers. And I think that will also generate a caring for future generations. So that's generally what I think about risk. When it comes to the question of security, it's slightly different. I think there are massive security issues thrown up by the problem of climate change, because climate change is going to bring about new kinds of social conflict. Conflict over scarce resources, conflict because of climate refugees coming from other countries. There's going to be a certain degree of social fragmentation and breakdown. So the question is, how do you tackle that kind of social breakdown? How do you deal with the kind of insecurities or security conflicts which are going to rise because of that? Again, I think empathy is a solution here, because there's a lot of evidence showing that generating empathy in society is a way to reduce social violence and social conflict. And there's been a huge growth, almost a revolution of social projects in the last 20 years developing empathy. There have been fantastic empathy building projects in the Palestinian territories between Israelis and Palestinians, grassroots peace building projects. I've personally been involved in projects to reduce gang violence in housing estates in Britain and gun violence, trying to develop empathy amongst gang members, between police and young people involved or at risk of involvement in gangs. So I think there's a huge potential for a whole new generation of empathy building projects to build the kind of social bonds that will hold a society like ours together when it's faced by the huge social problems caused by climate change, the social fragmentation, the violence, and the general situation of security problems that will be arising, right now, but not necessarily right now, but coming in future generations.